Emily Carter had always believed that danger belonged to faraway battlefields, not suburban neighborhoods with trimmed hedges and tidy sidewalks. Her husband, Commander Mark Carter, had been a Navy SEAL for nearly 2 decades, enduring grueling deployments across the globe. He had faced enemies who fired from shadows, trudged through deserts and jungles, and returned with scars no one could see. Yet here, in the quiet Virginia suburb where they had chosen to settle after his retirement, Emily felt she had finally stepped into safety. She could breathe without fear of sudden midnight calls or unexpected knocks at the door. But safety was often an illusion. The storm began with whispers in places Emily had never been: corporate offices, dimly lit bars, and expensive homes where greed festered unchecked. Men with polished shoes and expensive suits spoke her name with venom. They were not soldiers, not trained killers, but ruthless businessmen who had once partnered with defense contractors. When Mark had exposed corruption during his final years of service, they lost millions. They had sworn vengeance. Killing him outright had been too risky. His reputation as a SEAL and his public recognition made any direct attempt a potential scandal. But Emily, quiet, unassuming Emily, seemed easier. They believed she carried pieces of Mark's legacy. In their twisted logic, she was a bridge to secrets hidden away, files that could damage them further. If not, she was at least a way to break him completely. Destroy the wife, and the warrior would crumble. At first, their plan felt clinical. Hire men to watch her. Map her schedule. Find her vulnerabilities. They imagined her as ordinary another suburban woman who shopped on Tuesdays, jogged at sunrise, and carried no sense of danger. They didn't understand what it meant to be married to a SEAL, to share a life with someone who thrived on discipline and vigilance. Emily herself didn't notice the threat immediately. Her days were predictable, filled with routines she had come to cherish. She rose early, often jogging the shaded paths near their home. She volunteered at the local church, coordinated food drives, and occasionally substituted as a teacher at the nearby elementary school. She had built a quiet existence, one that seemed normal from the outside. But the first warning came as a sensation she couldn't explain. On her morning jog, she felt a set of eyes on her. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia. Yet when she slowed, stretching near a bench, she noticed a car parked across the street, engine idling, windows tinted. She glanced once, twice, and ran harder. By the time she circled back, the car was gone. She didn't mention it to Mark. His health was already delicate from years of punishing missions. He had given so much of himself to the Navy, and though proud of his service, she wanted his retirement years to be peaceful. She told herself it was nothing, that suburban paranoia could make villains out of ordinary passers-by. But the feeling lingered. Days later, at the supermarket, she reached for a carton of eggs and caught sight of a man reflected in the glass doors. He wasn't shopping. He wasn't even pretending. He stood at the end of the aisle, eyes fixed, phone in hand. She turned quickly, pretending to scan shelves, then forced herself to walk calmly to the next row. When she circled back, the man was gone. Emily's heart pounded, but she told herself not to overreact. Still, her instincts, a sharpened intuition built from years beside a SEAL, wouldn't let the thought go. Something was happening. The conspirators grew bolder. They had her schedule mapped to the minute. She left home at 6 a.m. for runs. She shopped on Wednesdays. She volunteered Friday evenings. They documented everything, filling notebooks with her patterns. One whispered, "She's predictable. This will be easy." Yet they underestimated her. Living with Mark had taught Emily subtle habits most civilians never practiced. She checked mirrors while driving, memorized license plates, and noted changes in the environment. Mark had taught her in passing, never expecting she'd need it, but she absorbed every lesson. Stay aware, he used to say. The world is safer when you're watching it. The next sign came when her neighbor, Mrs. Dawson, mentioned strangers near Emily's house. Funny thing, the older woman said one afternoon. 2 men in a dark sedan parked down the street yesterday. Didn't know them. They stayed for hours, then drove off. Emily smiled politely, thanked her, and locked the door as soon as she stepped inside. She leaned against the wood, her heart racing. That night she couldn't sleep. The house, once a sanctuary, felt watched. Her suspicions deepened when she found the back gate open. Mark always closed it, and Emily double-checked it herself. Yet one morning, it swung in the breeze. She searched for signs of footprint, a broken latch, but saw nothing obvious. Still, dread sank deeper into her chest. Emily began altering her habits. She changed her jogging route. She left lights on at odd hours. She carried pepper spray in her bag and kept her phone charged at all times. Outwardly, she seemed composed, but inside, the unease grew. The conspirators, frustrated by her unpredictability, pressed harder. One pushed for faster action. "She's slipping," he said. "She's not as predictable as before." But the leader silenced him. "Patience. She's still human. Fear will make her careless." Emily wasn't careless. She was becoming sharper, more vigilant. At the grocery store, she noticed the same car parked 2 rows away on multiple trips. At church, she felt eyes on her as she helped with food donations. At night, she closed the curtains early, watching shadows stretch across the yard. And then came the break-in attempt. She was away, visiting her sister for the weekend, when her neighbor called. Someone had tried forcing her back door open. The frame was splintered, the lock bent. Nothing was stolen, but the message was clear: someone wanted inside. Emily felt her stomach twist as she listened, clutching the phone tightly. This was no longer paranoia. It was real. She sat in her sister's guest room that night, the ceiling fan spinning slowly above her, and realized she had a choice. She could ignore the danger, pretending it would fade, or she could act. She thought of Mark, his steady gaze, his unbreakable will. He would never ignore a threat. Neither would she. Emily decided she would not face this storm alone. Somewhere in Virginia, men who once stood beside her husband still carried their code: never leave one behind. She knew it was time to reach out. The conspirators thought they were hunting prey. In truth, they were waking warriors. The game had begun. The men who wanted Emily dead were not ordinary criminals. They were former contractors, businessmen who once sat in boardrooms, surrounded by polished oak tables, a scent of expensive cigars hanging in the air. Their world had been lucrative until Mark Carter, during his final years as a Navy SEAL, exposed the rot in their operations. Defense money had been misused, lives endangered, missions compromised. Mark had testified, stood firm, and with his reputation as a warrior and commander, his words carried weight. Millions evaporated. Reputations shattered. The men nursed their humiliation like an open wound. Now they sought vengeance, not in the public arena where lawsuits and hearings dragged for years, but in the shadows where they believed they held the advantage. To destroy Mark Carter, they needed only to strike at the heart of his life, Emily. At first, their meetings carried a tone of arrogance. They rented private rooms in restaurants or huddled in sleek apartments, whispering strategies. "She's soft," one of them said, sipping whiskey. "Housewife, charity worker, small-town woman. Easy target," another laughed, picturing her shocked face in her final moments. They mistook her quietness for fragility. Their arrogance blinded them. They assembled a small crew of watchers, men accustomed to tailing debtors or rivals, not trained operatives. These watchers followed Emily's daily life with unnerving attention. One kept a notebook where he jotted precise times. Leaves house, 6:02 a.m. for run. Stops at coffee shop, 6:35. Grocery store every Wednesday at 10. Church volunteer shift Friday, 5 to 8. Another snapped photos with his phone, building a gallery of her life, unaware each click brought them closer to the jaws of a trap they couldn't see. Emily, however, was no ordinary Mark. She didn't know who they were or why they wanted her, but she felt their presence. It began as small ripples, an unease that followed her into daylight. On one run, as her shoes pounded pavement, she glanced at a passing sedan with tinted windows. It drove slowly, keeping pace longer than comfort allowed. Another morning, she spotted the same vehicle parked near the trailhead, a man pretending to read a newspaper. Her stomach tightened. She kept running, but every nerve in her body screamed caution. Her instincts, sharpened by years of living alongside Mark, refused to let her dismiss the threat. She remembered the countless lessons he had taught, without intending to check blind spots when driving. Notice recurring patterns. Trust your gut. When something feels off, he used to say, it usually is. At the grocery store, the watchers closed in with greater confidence. Emily, reaching for produce, noticed a man standing motionless near the entrance. He didn't hold a basket, didn't even pretend to shop. His gaze lingered too long. Emily didn't flinch. She walked calmly to the register, but her eyes swept the glass, catching his reflection again. He raised his phone, angling it subtly toward her. That night, she lay awake replaying the scene. Why would strangers follow her? What did they want? She thought of Mark's enemies' men, who had lost more than money when he spoke the truth. Perhaps, she reasoned, their grudges extended further than she had imagined. The thought chilled her, yet she refused to crumble. The conspirators believed patience was their greatest strength. Don't rush it, their leader warned during one late-night meeting. We're not thugs. This isn't sloppy. We'll study her until there are no surprises. Then one clean strike. But their confidence overlooked a critical detail. Surveillance works both ways. While they recorded Emily's every step, Emily began recording them in her mind. She noticed the same license plate appearing in different parking lots. She memorized faces that tried too hard to blend in. She even began altering her habits deliberately, arriving at church earlier than usual, jogging routes out of sequence. The watchers grew frustrated, reporting back that she was slippery. She's changing patterns, one complained. Doesn't matter, another replied. She's still alone. Alone. That word became their fatal mistake. Emily was never truly alone. Though Mark had retired, the Brotherhood of Navy SEALs did not dissolve with a handshake and a folded uniform. They were bound by loyalty deeper than blood. Emily had sat through deployments with wives of other SEALs, shared tears, celebrated homecomings. She knew that somewhere, a single phone call could summon protectors forged in the same fire that had shaped her husband. But for now, she kept her suspicion close, testing her instincts before she acted. The conspirators escalated their tactics. One evening, as Emily left church, she noticed two men across the street. They leaned casually against a lamppost, pretending to chat, but their eyes never left her. She gripped her bag tighter and walked steadily to her car, never breaking stride. As she drove away, she spotted headlights in her rearview mirror, trailing her longer than coincidence allowed. She didn't panic. Instead, she circled the block, turned unexpectedly, and eventually lost them. By the time she reached home, she was certain this was organized. The leader of the conspiracy grew impatient. We're wasting time, he barked during another meeting. She's nothing. End it. But one of his associates hesitated. Something's off. She's not reacting like she should. She's aware. Awareness doesn't stop bullets, the leader snapped. Still, the seeds of doubt had been planted. Meanwhile, Emily's sense of danger solidified into certainty. The break-in attempt at her home shattered any lingering denial. She had been away, but the back door bore the evidence-splintered wood, a lock bent as though pried. Nothing stolen, nothing touched inside, only the violation of knowing someone had tried to enter. She called the police, but the responding officer dismissed it as a random attempt. Emily knew better. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the damage. She poured herself tea, hands steady despite the storm inside. She thought of Mark's voice, calm and commanding. If you're ever cornered, don't panic. Think. Plan. Trust the people you can call. She reached for her phone, scrolling through contacts, her finger hovering over names she hadn't dialed in years. Men who had fought beside Mark, men who understood danger not as theory, but as life itself. She wasn't ready to call them yet, but she felt the moment drawing near. The conspirators, emboldened, prepared their next move. They studied maps of her neighborhood, marked her jogging trails, and highlighted the parking garage she often used when visiting downtown. Their notes spoke of precision, but beneath their confidence lurked arrogance. They believed her silence meant helplessness. They believed her composure meant ignorance. They didn't realize Emily Carter was already preparing her own battlefield. The watchers still lingered outside her routines, convinced they were predators circling prey. Yet in truth, they were already being measured, their patterns noted, their mistakes catalogued. Emily carried herself like a woman living her normal life, but beneath the surface, she was sharpening her awareness like a blade. She knew the danger was real. She knew she was being hunted. And though fear pressed against her chest each night, she refused to surrender. The plot against her was unfolding piece by piece, but the conspirators had forgotten a timeless truth. When you scheme against a Navy SEAL's family, you're not just fighting one woman, you're waking an entire brotherhood. The storm they thought they controlled was about to turn against them. Emily Carter woke before dawn, as she always did. She sat by the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching the first pale light creep over the horizon. To anyone else, it was just another quiet morning. To her, every sound was amplified: the creak of the porch wood, the distant hum of a car engine, the faint shuffle of leaves outside. She was no longer imagining things. She was being watched. But if the men outside thought they were instilling fear, they misunderstood her completely. Fear sharpened Emily. Fear made her more alert, not weaker. The attempted break-in had shattered all illusions. Police reports had been filed, locks replaced, and security lights installed. But Emily knew that paperwork and hardware were not solutions to what she faced. These weren't random burglars looking for electronics to pawn. These were men with intent, with patience, and with enough arrogance to stalk her openly. She didn't know their full motive yet, but she could feel the weight of it pressing closer with every passing day. Mark's words echoed constantly in her memory. Threats aren't always about what's in front of you. They're about who's behind it. That reminder fueled her determination. She would not crumble, not in her home, not on her streets, not in front of those who wanted her broken. Still, she couldn't deny the pulse of tension that followed her everywhere. At the grocery store, she noticed the same silver sedan parked across the lot 2 weeks in a row. The driver sat too still, sunglasses on even under clouds. Emily entered calmly, shopping as if nothing was wrong, but her senses remained on high alert. Every aisle she walked, she checked reflections in freezer doors, mirrored corners, and glass panes. Twice, she caught glimpses of the same figure, pretending to browse, but never picking up a single item. At church, her sanctuary of peace, unease crept in as well. During a Friday food drive, she noticed a stranger leaning against the far wall. He held a phone in his hand, pretending to scroll, but his eyes lifted too often to watch her. When she turned unexpectedly, their gazes locked. He shifted uncomfortably and left without a word. Emily's pulse raced, but outwardly she remained calm, continuing to hand out meals as if nothing had happened. That night, alone in her home, she replayed the moment. She had been married long enough to a man of war to recognize when someone was conducting surveillance. These weren't coincidences. This was deliberate. She wasn't paranoid, she was being targeted. Her choice was clear: continue pretending nothing was wrong, or act. Emily chose to act. She started by adjusting her patterns even more. Instead of jogging every morning, she skipped days at random. Sometimes she ran earlier than usual, sometimes later. She varied her shopping trips, driving to different stores, never at the same hour. She even changed the path she took to church, turning down side streets and doubling back unexpectedly. To the conspirators, it was maddening. The watchers reported back with frustration. "She's breaking routine?" one grumbled, flipping through his notebook filled with useless times and schedules. "Doesn't matter," another insisted. "She's just a civilian." Patterns or not, we'll get her. But Emily's unpredictability wasn't just instinct, it was strategy. Every deviation she made wasn't random. She was testing them, watching for tails, noticing which cars appeared no matter the route. The silver sedan, the black SUV, a man with a baseball cap that always seemed to be near, whether at the post office or gas station. And with each test, her conviction grew. They weren't just watching. They were closing in. One evening, as she prepared dinner, her neighbor Mrs. Dawson knocked at the door again. "Emily," the older woman said, her voice low, "I don't want to alarm you, but I saw the same car parked outside your street again. Just sitting there. 2 men inside. I thought maybe they were waiting for someone, but after an hour, I called my son to check. He said they drove off when he walked by." Emily thanked her, heart pounding. This was confirmation. Even her neighbors saw it now. After closing the door, she leaned against it and exhaled slowly. Enough was enough. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a name she hadn't dialed in years. Jack Hawk Hawkins, one of Mark's closest SEAL teammates. He had retired a few years earlier, moving into private security work. She hesitated only a moment before pressing call. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered, gravelly and steady. "Emily Carter." "It's been a while." "Jack," she said softly, "I need help." The line went silent for a beat, and his tone sharpened. "What's going on?" She explained everything: the car on her jogs, the man in the grocery store, the attempted break-in, a feeling of being hunted. She tried to keep her voice steady, but her words spilled faster as the weight lifted slightly from sharing. Jack didn't interrupt. He listened, as SEALs always did, absorbing every detail, cataloging, analyzing. When she finished, his response was calm but firm. "You did the right thing calling me. You're not paranoid. You're being surveilled. And if they've escalated to break-ins, they're preparing for more. Don't worry. We'll handle this." "We?" Emily asked. Jack chuckled lightly. "You didn't think I'd come alone, did you? Mark may have retired, but his brothers never leave family behind." Relief and dread clashed inside her. She was no longer alone, but the fact she needed SEALs meant this was bigger than she had wanted to admit. The next day, Emily carried on as usual, at least on the surface. She went to the market, smiling at the cashier, picking up her groceries. She drove carefully home, but this time she wasn't truly alone. Jack had arrived quietly that morning, blending into the background with a precision only years of training could provide. He tailed her unseen, documenting the silver sedan, photographing the black SUV, and noting every suspicious face that lingered near her. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt a sliver of reassurance. She knew she was still being hunted, but now the hunters were being watched as well. That night, Jack sat in her kitchen, laptop open, reviewing the photos he had taken. "You're right," he confirmed, pointing to the screen. "They're following you. Same faces, same vehicles. Not random, coordinated." Emily's stomach tightened. "Who are they?" Jack's expression darkened. "Not sure yet, but whoever they are, they're sloppy compared to real operators. That's good for us. Their arrogance will be their weakness." Emily nodded, determination in her eyes. "Then let's use it." For the conspirators, things were unraveling. Their patience turned to frustration, their control slipping. "She's changing again," one complained. "Roots times everything." "She knows." "Impossible," the leader snapped. "She's just a civilian." But the watchers exchanged uneasy glances. They had stalked plenty of people before, but none had ever adapted like Emily. None had ever carried herself with such composure under pressure. The truth was dawning on them, even if they couldn't admit it. Emily Carter wasn't ordinary prey. And soon, they would learn she wasn't alone anymore. The air in Emily Carter's home felt different after Jack Hawkins arrived. It was still the same house with its soft cream walls, its familiar scent of lavender and coffee, yet a quiet current of readiness ran through it now. Jack had a way of moving through rooms without disturbing anything, his steps silent, his presence steady. To Emily, it was as though a shadow had taken form, not a threat but a guardian. She had not realized until that moment how heavy the silence of her fear had been. Now she was not alone. Jack worked methodically, turning her kitchen table into a makeshift command post. His laptop glowed dimly, displaying surveillance photos he had already captured. A digital map of her neighborhood flickered on the screen, with pins marking suspicious cars, unusual activity, and the patterns of the men following her. His voice remained calm as he spoke. "These guys aren't pros," he said, tapping the screen. "They're arrogant. They think patience makes them invisible. But they're predictable now. They'll regret that." Emily sipped her tea, forcing her hands to remain still. "And what happens next?" she asked. Jack's eyes lifted to hers. "Next, we stop reacting. We start watching them." By the following morning, Emily's quiet street had transformed into an invisible network of protectors. Not uniforms, not patrol cars, just men and women who had spent their lives learning how to blend in, to vanish, to observe without being noticed. They were Marx Brothers in arms, drawn from across the country with nothing more than a single phone call. One took a position as a jogger on Emily's usual route, earbuds in but eyes scanning constantly. Another posed as a delivery driver making rounds in the neighborhood. A third parked seemingly broken-down car 2 blocks away, cameras hidden in its vents, capturing every movement on the street. Their presence was never obvious. To the conspirators, the suburb still looked the same, but the hunters had walked into a battlefield without realizing it. Emily played her part. She carried on as before, shopping, volunteering, jogging, but her confidence returned in small doses. She knew that somewhere, at any given moment, trained eyes were on her, not as predators, but as shields. When she caught sight of a familiar face at the coffee shop, or noticed the jogger keeping pace a few yards behind, she felt a flicker of calm. For the conspirators, however, the picture began to change. Their watchers reported back confused. "She's still changing her patterns," one muttered into his phone. "But she doesn't seem scared anymore. Maybe she's gotten sloppy," another guessed. But their leader frowned. "No, she's acting too normal. People under threat either panic or hide. She's doing neither. Watch for tails. If she's got someone covering her, we'll find out." They didn't find out. Every time they tried to probe deeper, the SEAL team outmaneuvered them. A silver sedan would trail Emily, only for a different car to slide into the lane behind, forcing the sedan to lose sight. A man with a camera waiting outside the church would suddenly feel eyes on him, sharp and cold, until he retreated without understanding why. Phone calls they made started glitching with interference. Unknown numbers began appearing on their logs. The conspirators felt, for the first time, what it was like to be prey. Jack sat with Emily one evening, going over footage from the hidden cameras. The men following her appeared on screen, their faces clear now, their routines mapped just as they had mapped hers. "They're sloppy," Jack repeated. "They're making the same mistakes you used to make before you started adapting. We're 3 steps ahead now." Emily leaned closer, studying the images. "Do you know who they are yet?" "Not exactly," Jack said. "But they're connected to the contracts Mark exposed. That much is clear. Their money trails will lead us to the top." Emily nodded, her jaw tightening. "Then what?" Jack's eyes hardened. "Then we show them what happens when you threaten ASEAL's family." The SEAL team's operation deepened. One member hacked into the conspirators' phones, pulling call logs and messages. Another set up long-range lenses in an abandoned building across from the conspirators' meeting spot. The suburban chessboard the men had believed they controlled now belonged to someone else entirely. And through it all, Emily performed her role flawlessly. She was the calm center of the storm, walking with steady steps, never giving away the network that surrounded her. Her presence lured the conspirators further into exposure. The tension in the conspirators' camp grew like a coiled spring. Their leader barked orders, demanding more aggressive surveillance. "If she's got protection, I want to know who," he snarled. "We can't afford mistakes." But mistakes were all they were making now. On one rainy afternoon, a watcher tried to follow Emily from the grocery store to her car. He didn't notice the jogger slowing behind him until a firm hand landed on his shoulder, stopping him cold. "You're in the wrong place, friend," the jogger said quietly, his voice low but lethal. The watcher stammered an excuse and backed away, retreating to his car with trembling hands. He didn't know who the jogger was, but he felt the unmistakable weight of someone who had been trained to kill. That night, he called the leader. "Something's wrong," he said. "They're on to us." The leader slammed his fist on the table. "No, we're on to them. Do you hear me? We finish this. One strike. Clean. Done." But his voice betrayed the first threads of doubt. Back in Emily's home, Jack gathered the team. They sat around the table, their faces lit by the glow of laptops and low lamps. Maps, photos, and phone records lay spread out like the pieces of a puzzle. Jack's tone was steady but firm. "They're escalating. We're close to knowing their full plan. But the more desperate they get, the more dangerous they'll become." Emily listened quietly, her hands clasped. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Jack looked at her, admiration flickering briefly in his eyes. "Just keep doing what you're doing. Live your life. Be the bait if you have to, but know we're always there." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then let's end this." Outside, the neighborhood looked calm under the soft glow of streetlights. Children played in yards. Dogs barked in the distance. But in the shadows, a silent war had begun. The conspirators believed they still controlled the game, but the truth was already written. The hunters had become the hunted. And Emily Carter, once a target, was now at the heart of a counterattack she didn't yet fully understand, but trusted completely. The conspirators were unraveling. Their confidence, once ironclad, now cracked under the weight of invisible pressure. Every time they thought they had Emily cornered, something interfered: an unexpected car, a stranger's sharp stare, a failed tale. They whispered doubts into their phones, but their leader silenced them with rage. "She's a civilian," he barked. Don't tell me you're afraid of a widow. We finish this in one strike. No more waiting. That night, in a dim basement stinking of cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey, the plan crystallized. The leader drew a rough map of the downtown parking garage Emily frequented after her weekly volunteer shift. This is it, he said. She walks in, she never walks out. The men nodded, more from fear of him than confidence in the plan. Each was given a roll, one to block the exit, one to cut the lights, two to move in quickly. They rehearsed it in whispers, certain the end was near. But what they didn't know was that their own rehearsal had already been overheard. Jack Hawkins watched the grainy footage on his laptop with grim satisfaction. One of his teammates had placed a hidden camera in the conspirators' safe house, disguised in a smoke detector. Now the entire plan was laid bare. Time, place, method. They think they're hunters, Jack muttered, but they've walked straight into a cage. The SEALs leaned over the table. Some grinned, others shook their heads in disbelief. They're amateurs, one said. Overconfident. Sloppy. Jack nodded. That's why we don't underestimate them. A cornered animal can still bite. But this is our chance to end it clean. He looked at Emily. She sat across from him, her face pale but resolute. They'll expect you to walk in alone. Are you willing to go through with this? Emily didn't flinch. If it ends this, yes. I trust you. Her calm cut through the tension like steel. The room fell silent, each man silently acknowledging her courage. She wasn't a SEAL, but in that moment, she carried their spirit. The preparations began immediately. The SEALs scouted the garage, noting every blind spot, every echoing corner. They mapped the conspirators' planned positions, then layered their own strategy on top, like a net. Cameras were hidden in support beams. Law enforcement was quietly alerted, waiting on standby. Exits were sealed with subtle barricades that wouldn't be noticed until too late. On the day of the trap, the atmosphere was electric. Emily drove downtown as usual, her heart hammering against her ribs. She parked in her normal spot, shoulders steady, breath measured. Her phone buzzed once a coded signal from Jack. We're here. Hidden in shadows, the SEALs took their positions. Two crouched behind pillars, rifles equipped with non-lethal rounds. Another perched above on a maintenance platform, night vision goggles strapped tight. Jack himself stood near the stairwell, concealed but ready to move at the first sign of danger. The conspirators were already in place. One by one, they emerged from the darkness, circling Emily as she walked toward the stairwell. The leader smirked as he saw her. Finally, he whispered to himself. He signaled with a subtle wave. The lights flickered and went dark. Emily froze, but only for a heartbeat. Her pulse raced, but she remembered Jack's words. They want fear. Don't give it to them. She took another step forward, calm, collected. The conspirators moved quickly, boots echoing against concrete. One blocked the exit. Another stepped into her path. End of the line, he growled, reaching for her arm. But before his hand touched her, the darkness shifted. A blur of movement slammed into him from the side, knocking him flat. Another attacker turned, only to be pinned to the wall with a forearm across his throat. Shadows erupted into motion seals striking with precision, silent and unstoppable. Down, Jack barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Emily dropped instantly, crouching low as the SEALs swarmed. The conspirators panicked. They swung fists, pulled knives, tried to run, but every move was countered. One man rushed the stairwell, only to find himself staring down the barrel of a rifle. Another pulled a gun, but before he could fire, a SEAL twisted his wrist, sending the weapon clattering across the floor. The leader fought hardest, his desperation feral. He lunged at Emily, fury blazing in his eyes. You were supposed to be dead. He screamed. Jack intercepted him mid-stride, slamming him against a pillar with brutal force. "And you were supposed to be smarter," Jack hissed. The man struggled, veins bulging, but Jack's grip was immovable. "Game's over," Jack said coldly. "You picked the wrong family." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The conspirators were pinned, restrained, their arrogance stripped away. Some cursed, others begged, but it didn't matter anymore. The SEALs had dismantled them with ruthless efficiency, exposing their plot for what it was, a coward's attempt to silence the strong. Emily rose slowly, her breath unsteady, but her gaze unwavering. She looked at the men sprawled across the concrete and felt no pity. These were the faces of her nightmares, now powerless at her feet. Jack approached her, his voice softer now. "It's done," she exhaled, a long, shuddering release she hadn't realized she was holding. "No," she said quietly. "It's just beginning." Jack tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Emily's eyes hardened. Now the world learns who they were working for. As police officers poured into the garage, the SEALs handed over the captives along with a mountain of evidence, photos, recordings, financial trails. The leader spat venom, shouting threats and promises of revenge, but his words carried no weight now. The SEALs stood silently, their presence radiating authority. One officer shook his head in disbelief. "You boys just saved a life tonight," he said. Jack corrected him. "We saved more than that. We ended a war before it started." Emily listened, standing tall despite the exhaustion. For weeks she had lived in fear, waiting for shadows to strike. Now she understood something profound. Fear had no power when faced with loyalty, preparation, and courage. The conspirators had schemed to kill her. They had stalked her, plotted in darkness, convinced she was alone. But they had forgotten the one truth that defined her life. SEAL's family is never unprotected. That night, as Emily returned home under the watchful escort of her guardians, she felt the weight of survival settling into her bones. But she also felt something new, a fire kindled by her ordeal. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a witness to a story larger than herself, one that would not end with her safety, but with justice. And though the trap had been set and sprung with flawless precision, she knew the real battle was only beginning. Because the men who came for her were only soldiers of greed. The true masterminds were still out there, hidden in boardrooms and smoke-filled offices, waiting for their chance to strike again. Emily Carter, widow of a Navy SEAL, no longer feared them. She was ready. The parking garage reeked of oil and damp concrete. Fluorescent lights flickered weakly overhead, casting uneven shadows that stretched like claws along the walls. The conspirators had chosen this place, believing it would favor them, dark, echoing, easy to control. But as the moment arrived, the advantage slipped silently into the hands of others. Emily Carter walked steadily through the rows of cars, her heels tapping softly against the ground. Each step echoed louder than it should have, reverberating like a drumbeat in her chest. Her body screamed for flight, but her training through fear, the discipline learned from years beside her husband, kept her focused. She knew they were there, hidden in the gloom, waiting. The conspirators' leader gave the signal. Suddenly, the lights went black. The garage plunged into darkness, broken only by the hum of distant machinery and Emily's steady breathing. Boots scraped concrete. Figures emerged, circling her like wolves around a lamb. "You should have stayed quiet," one hissed. "Would have saved you a lot of pain?" Emily didn't answer. Her silence was defiance. They closed in. The leader raised his weapon, aiming squarely at her chest. "This ends tonight." It did, but not the way he imagined. The darkness shifted. From the shadows came a blur of movement, silent, precise, unstoppable. The first conspirator barely registered the strike before he was on the ground, His arm twisted behind him, his weapon clattering uselessly across the floor. Another lunged forward, only to be yanked backward by a hand gripping his collar and slammed into a pillar so hard the concrete cracked. The SEALs had arrived. Emily dropped to the floor, just as Jack had instructed, keeping herself low and centered. Around her, chaos erupted, not wild, flailing chaos, but controlled fury. The SEALs moved like phantoms, striking with practiced precision. Each motion was efficient, no wasted energy, no hesitation. To the conspirators, it was like fighting shadows that knew their every move before they made it. One attacker pulled a knife, slashing wildly. A SEAL stepped in close, trapping his arm, twisting until the blade fell harmlessly. With one strike, the man crumpled to the floor, groaning. Another conspirator drew a gun and fired, but the shot went wide, echoing like thunder in the garage. Before he could squeeze again, a SEAL crashed into him from the side, wrenching the pistol away and sending him sprawling. The leader cursed, fury boiling. "Fight back. She's right there." But his men were already faltering. They had expected a terrified widow. Instead, they faced warriors who had stared death in the eye on foreign soil, in seas and deserts, and never blinked. Emily pressed her back to a parked car, her breath shallow but steady. She forced herself not to panic as the storm raged around her. She could hear every sound, the thud of fists, the crack of bone, the sharp grunts of effort. Yet beneath it all was a strange calm. These men weren't just fighting. They were orchestrating. Jack's voice cut through the fray. Left flank now. 2 SEALs moved in unison, taking down another attacker with fluid coordination. Secure the weapon. A gun slid across the floor toward Emily's feet. She kicked it under the car without hesitation, exactly as Jack had instructed earlier. She wasn't helpless. She was part of the operation. The conspirators fought with desperation now. Their fear twisted into rage, but rage was sloppy. They swung wildly, burned energy quickly, shouted to one another with panic rising in their throats. One man tried to run for the stairwell. He didn't make it 2 steps before a SEAL swept his legs, sending him crashing down hard. Another screamed and charged at Emily directly. She froze for half a second, until a shadow appeared in front of her. Jack. The man didn't even see the strike coming. Jack pivoted, his elbow slamming into the attacker's jaw with brutal efficiency. The conspirator dropped instantly. Jack turned to Emily, eyes steady. "You okay?" Emily nodded, her throat tight. "Yes. Good. Stay down." He moved again before she could say more, vanishing back into the melee. The leader roared, pulling a second gun from his waistband. "You think you can scare me?" He shouted, firing blindly into the dark. The muzzle flashes lit his face, twisted with fury. But fear lurked in his eyes. Jack advanced, calm and deliberate. He didn't flinch as bullets sparked against concrete nearby. His voice was steady, cutting through the noise. "You're done." "Drop it." The leader aimed directly at Emily, desperation in his voice. "Not until she's gone." In that instant, Jack moved. He lunged, slamming into the leader's arm, twisting it upward. The gun fired harmlessly into the ceiling as Jack drove his shoulder into the man's chest, pinning him hard against a pillar. The weapon fell, clattering to the ground. The leader struggled, thrashing like a trapped animal. "You can't stop this. You don't know who you're dealing with." Jack's grip tightened, his voice low and lethal. "No, you don't know who you're dealing with." Within minutes, the fight was over. The conspirators lay sprawled across the garage floor, groaning, restrained, their weapons scattered uselessly. The SEALs stood above them, calm as if they had simply completed a drill. Their breathing was steady, their eyes sharp, their bodies unshaken. Emily rose slowly, her legs trembling as she stepped forward. She looked at the men who had stalked her for weeks, who had invaded her life, who had tried to end her. Now they looked small, powerless, stripped of their menace. The leader still spat curses, even pinned to the ground. "You think this is victory? You don't understand. We're not afraid to die." Jack crouched low, his gaze unyielding. "Neither are we." "That's why you lost." Silence followed. The conspirators finally understood. These weren't ordinary men protecting a widow. These were warriors who had built their lives on the edge of death, who didn't fear the darkness, but thrived in it. Against such resolve, the conspirators never stood a chance. Sirens wailed in the distance. Red and blue lights soon flashed at the garage's entrance as law enforcement poured in. Officers stormed the scene, weapons drawn, only to find the SEALs already in control. One officer blinked at the sight of the restrained conspirators. "What the hell happened here?" Jack straightened, brushing dust from his shirt. "They tried to ambush her. We ambushed them instead." The officer shook his head in disbelief, moving to cuff the men. Emily stood tall now, her shoulders back, her fear burned away by fire. She locked eyes with the leader one last time. His face, once smug and certain, now dripped with sweat and defeat. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The message was clear. They had schemed to kill her, but discovered too late that Navy SEALs never feared death. That night, as Emily sat quietly at her home, surrounded by the steady presence of her protectors, she replayed the battle in her mind. The sounds, the shadows, the way the SEALs moved like a storm unleashed. For the first time in weeks, she felt something she thought she had lost forever. Safety. But more than that, strength. She understood now that her survival wasn't just luck. It was the product of loyalty, courage, and a brotherhood that refused to let fear dictate its course. And she knew, deep in her bones, that the fight was not truly over. The men who had come for her were pawns. The real enemy still waited in the shadows. But Emily Carter no longer trembled. She had seen the face of death, and like the SEALs, she would never fear it again. The garage was still echoing with the clash of boots and the scrape of handcuffs when Emily Carter stepped into the night. The SEALs had already melted back into the shadows, their job done for the moment, leaving law enforcement to process the scene. Red and blue lights painted the concrete walls, flashing across the pale faces of the conspirators, now bound and silent. Emily felt the cool air on her skin and realized she was breathing differently. Slower, freer. For weeks, her lungs had worked in shallow bursts, every breath tangled in fear. Tonight, it was different. She was alive. But survival was not the end. It was the beginning of exposure. Within 24 hours, news spread like wildfire. Local headlines screamed of a foiled assassination plot. By the following morning, national outlets carried the story. Widow of decorated Navy SEAL, targeted in contract killing scheme. Television anchors speculated about motives, shadowy business ties, and the mystery of the retired military operatives who had intervened. Emily's name filled every broadcast. Reporters camped outside her home, their lenses glittering in the sunlight, voices clamoring for a quote. "How does it feel to have survived? Do you know who ordered the hit? Were Navy SEALs really involved?" Emily spoke only once, through a short written statement. "I am grateful to be alive. Justice is underway. I trust in the men who protected me, and I trust the truth will be revealed in time." The media speculated endlessly, but Emily knew the story was still being written, not on TV, but in courtrooms and investigations. The conspirators, now under heavy guard, were charged with conspiracy to commit murder, illegal weapons possession, and ties to fraudulent defense contracts. Their trial was fast-tracked, the government eager to make an example of them. But even in shackles, They smirked, their confidence not entirely broken. They were pawns, yes, but pawns who believed the real kings and queens behind their scheme were untouchable. Emily sat in the courtroom during the hearings, her posture straight, her eyes steady. The men glanced at her often, sneers tugging at their lips, but she refused to look away. Each time her gaze met theirs, she thought of Mark, how he had stared down enemies far stronger, how he had taught her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to bow to it. When called to testify, Emily walked to the stand without hesitation. The courtroom hushed. The prosecutor asked her to recount the weeks leading up to the ambush. She spoke clearly, her voice neither trembling nor raised. She told of the strange cars, the unfamiliar faces, the whispers of danger that grew louder each day. She explained how she had reached out to Jack Hawkins, how the SEALs had stepped in quietly, how they had turned hunters into prey. Her words carried weight, not just because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Calm, composed, unwavering. The defense tried to ravel her. "Mrs. Carter, isn't it true you imagined much of this threat? That your paranoia made ordinary events seem sinister?" Emily's eyes locked on the attorney. "Imagined?" she repeated softly. Then she leaned forward, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Those men ambushed me in a dark garage with guns drawn. Do you imagine that, sir?" The courtroom stirred with murmurs. The judge struck his gavel, but the moment was already seared into the record. Jack and the SEAL team stayed in the shadows, testifying only under sealed proceedings. They had no desire for headlines or glory, but Emily knew the trial could never have reached this point without them. As the days unfolded, more evidence surfaced: phone logs tracing back to offshore accounts, encrypted emails connecting the conspirators to larger networks of fraud. Prosecutors built a mountain of proof, piece by piece dismantling the arrogance that had driven these men to her doorstep. Still, the conspirators clung to defiance. "We're soldiers," the leader snarled in court one day. "You can kill us, jail us, but you'll never stop what we started." Emily's heart pounded, but she kept her expression steady. When cross-examined, she simply answered, "You mistook greed for courage. That's why you failed." Her words struck deeper than she expected. Even the jurors shifted, as if recognizing truth in her calm condemnation. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy intensified. Some painted Emily as a symbol of resilience, a woman who had faced death and refused to crumble. Others framed her as an unlikely heroine, her life thrust unwillingly into a battle between justice and corruption. She gave no interviews, no dramatic speeches. She simply lived, appearing in court each day with quiet dignity. Her restraint made her more compelling than any sound bite ever could. At night, when the house was still, she reflected on how drastically life had changed. She thought of Mark often, of how he would have stood where Jack stood, how his training now lived on in the men who had saved her. She whispered to herself before sleep, "We won, Mark. They didn't break me." Weeks later, the verdict came. The jury found the conspirators guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted, some with relief, others with outrage, but Emily remained still, her hands folded in her lap. Justice had been served, yet she knew this was only the surface. For every conspirator now bound to a cell, there were financiers, executives, and corrupt officials lurking behind curtains. Their names hadn't surfaced yet, but Emily could feel their presence like a storm brewing on the horizon. After court adjourned, a journalist cornered her outside. "Mrs. Carter, what do you want the public to take from this verdict?" Emily paused, meeting the swarm of cameras head-on. "That courage is not reserved for the battlefield," she said. "That silence is not weakness. And that loyalty, true loyalty, can't be bought or broken." Her words went viral overnight. They weren't rehearsed, weren't polished, but they resonated. Across the country, veterans, widows, and ordinary citizens shared her statement as a rallying cry. Emily Carter, once a quiet widow living in Virginia, had become a voice. That night, Jack visited her home. He stood at the doorway, as steady as always, his eyes carrying both weariness and pride. "It's not over," he said simply. Emily nodded. "I know. The men in suits haven't shown their faces yet." Jack leaned against the doorframe. "But you're not alone. You never were." For the first time since Mark's passing, Emily allowed herself a small smile. "I know that too." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of battles fought and battles yet to come pressing quietly between them. The trial was over. The aftermath had begun. And though the conspirators were behind bars, Emily understood the truth. The storm wasn't finished, but she was ready. Emily Carter sat by the window in her living room, watching the afternoon sunlight spill across her garden. The roses she had planted months ago bloomed with unexpected vibrancy, their petals glistening like tiny flames in the warmth. The house felt different now, safer, yet charged with a quiet electricity. Every sound, once a source of anxiety, was now a reminder of survival, of courage earned rather than granted. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Weeks ago, her life had been ordinary. She had volunteered at the local church, jogged along quiet streets, and worked quietly to honor the memory of her husband, Mark, a decorated Navy SEAL. Then the shadow appeared, men who believed they could take her life, thinking her fragile, thinking her alone. They had been wrong. With the SEALs watching, guiding, and protecting, she had learned a new rhythm. Danger no longer paralyzed her. It sharpened her instincts. Every moment of fear became an instrument, every instinct a tool. And when the ambush occurred, she witnessed firsthand what she had only glimpsed in Mark's stories: the lethal precision, the unwavering focus, the silent code of warriors who did not fear death. The conspirators were behind bars, their plans dismantled, their arrogance exposed. Yet Emily understood that their fall was just one layer of the storm. The men who had funded them, the hidden architects in boardrooms and offices, still moved unseen, still plotting. The battle was far from over. Jack Hawkins, her steadfast protector, entered the room quietly, carrying a folder of files and evidence. His presence was a comforting weight. "The trial ended," he said, voice low. "But the investigation continues. There are still those who financed the attempt, those who thought they could buy silence." Emily nodded, her gaze steady. "Then we continue. We expose them." Jack allowed a rare smile. "That's why you survived. You don't just endure. You act." The following months blurred into a rhythm of strategy, investigation, and public scrutiny. Emily worked closely with Jack and a handful of SEAL operatives who had retired into investigative roles. Every lead was followed, every financial trail traced. They discovered shell corporations, offshore accounts, and hidden partnerships that linked the conspirators to a network of corrupt executives and rogue defense contractors. Each revelation strengthened their resolve. Emily became more than a witness. She became an active participant in the hunt. Using her calm presence and intuitive mind, she compiled reports, identified patterns, and prepared testimony for hearings that had yet to be scheduled. She learned to navigate legal frameworks, cybersecurity loopholes, and the subtle art of influence. Her ordinary life had been replaced with extraordinary vigilance. Yet she carried it all with dignity, refusing to be consumed by fear or revenge. Her reputation grew quietly at first. Local newspapers praised her composure, national media highlighted her testimony, and veterans networks celebrated her courage. She became a symbol of resilience, not the glamorized kind, but the real, unwavering kind born from survival, intelligence, and trust in loyal allies. Despite the media attention, Emily's home remained her sanctuary. The SEALs maintained a discreet watch, ensuring that no lingering threat could approach unnoticed. They moved in shadows, as they always had, their presence unannounced yet omnipresent. Emily sometimes caught glimpses of them, a pair jogging along the perimeter of the neighborhood, a vehicle parked inconspicuously down the street, but never directly interfering unless necessary. Their loyalty was total, unspoken, and unshakable. She found herself reflecting often on Mark's teachings. Courage was not simply fighting fear. He had said it was the willingness to act when fear screamed to freeze. Loyalty was not obedience. It was presence, readiness, and sacrifice. In living with the SEALs, Emily had witnessed those truths daily. They were more than protectors. They were living examples of a code she now understood and respected. And through all of it, Emily discovered her own courage. One quiet evening, she attended a ceremony honoring veterans and fallen SEALs. She stood on the stage to speak, her voice firm and unwavering as she addressed the crowd. "Courage isn't born in comfort," she said. "It is forged in moments of fear, in decisions made when the outcome is uncertain, and in loyalty that cannot be bought. My husband taught me that. The men who protected me taught me that. And I stand here to honor that courage, not just in heroes in uniform, but in all who face the impossible and refuse to bow." The applause was thunderous. Veterans, families, and civilians alike recognized the authenticity in her words. She had transformed from a widow into a voice of resilience, a living testament to the power of trust, loyalty, and action. Yet even as the applause faded and she returned home, Emily's awareness remained sharp. The true masterminds had not been revealed. Boardrooms and offices far removed from the streets, she walked still contained men who thought their power made them untouchable. They had underestimated one thing: the combination of courage, loyalty, and relentless pursuit of truth. She met with Jack late that night in her living room. A map of potential leads lay on the table. "They're careful," he said, "but they make mistakes. They always do. We just have to be patient." Emily traced her finger along the map. "Then we continue, one step at a time. We make them visible." Jack nodded. "And when they are, we'll be ready." Her hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with anticipation. The fight had expanded, but so had her resolve. Emily understood something essential. Courage was not a fleeting victory. It was a legacy, a force that persisted, even when the battle seemed endless. Days turned into weeks, and Emily found a rhythm between ordinary life and extraordinary vigilance. She returned to volunteering, jogging, and simple routines, but each moment was infused with awareness. She trained in self-defense, studied situational awareness, and maintained a close correspondence with the SEALs, learning from their strategies and experiences. Her story began inspiring others, widows, women, and families of veterans who reached out to learn how she survived, how she navigated fear, and how she reclaimed agency in her life. Emily responded, quietly, humbly, emphasizing preparedness, trust, and courage. Through her resilience, a network began forming an informal alliance of civilians and veterans, united by the principle that fear should not dictate life and that loyalty, when honored, can protect even the most vulnerable. Months later, Emily sat once more in her garden, watching the roses bloom, their colors vivid against the green backdrop. Jack stood nearby, silent but present. "You've come far," he said softly. Emily smiled, a quiet strength in her eyes. "We've come far," she corrected. Together, the conspirators had been imprisoned. A first wave of corrupt financiers identified. But the journey was ongoing. Emily knew that vigilance, courage, and loyalty were perpetual. The world was filled with those who thought power equaled invincibility, but she had learned otherwise. And she was not alone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, Emily understood the truth fully. Courage is not defined by battle alone. It is defined by action, by endurance, by the willingness to rise again after fear, and by the unwavering loyalty of those who refuse to let you fall. She had survived an attempt on her life, confronted the violence of greed and arrogance, and witnessed the might of warriors who feared nothing. She had learned that survival was not enough. It was action, courage, and legacy that truly mattered. Emily Carter, widow of a Navy SEAL, had become more than herself. She had become a symbol, a force, and a testament. And though the hidden masterminds still lurked, she no longer feared them. Because she had seen death, faced darkness, and walked with warriors who never flinched. And she would never fear it again. The story was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next.